Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about the Empire in Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and to talk about the essential campaign units to use in an Imperial campaign. Also talk about hero choices and lord choices, regular lord choices that you should go for in an Imperial campaign. Starting at tier 1, the only unit I'd recommend recruiting at tier 1 are archers. Now, these guys are a DLC unit for the Hunter and the Beast, so without that DLC, I probably recommend spamming swordsmen if you have no other choice, though you probably want to get to tier 2 as quickly as possible, which shouldn't really be too much of an issue in any Imperial campaign. But if you do have the Hunter and the Beast DLC, the units that you should use for like roughly 10 turns or so, maybe even less, the units you should be recruiting en masse are archers. They're pretty decent range units, though they're not especially great. They have limited range. Their missile strength only includes 2 armor-piercing missile damage, so they're not going to do so great. But the critical thing is, Warhammer 3 is all about spamming a bunch of armies, and in an Imperial campaign, while you have a decent economy, you don't have the best economy in the world, so it is kind of limited in how many armies you can recruit early on. So getting a bunch of archers, while they lack the armor piercing to deal with heavily armored units, they will do pretty decent against most early game foes. Let's say 10, maybe even 20 turns if you're really pushing it. Though I would say past 10 turns, you should start recruiting some other units. Again, if you don't have the Hunter and the Beast, I'd probably not recommend playing an Imperial campaign without the Hunter and the Beast, because it is going to come up very shortly. Again, it's not just that that particular DLC has an essential tier 1 unit, it has an essential tier 3 unit that the Empire desperately needs right now in their roster. Then we look at tier 2, we have crossbowmen. Like, crossbowmen are just a better version of the archers. They are more expensive as a unit, but they are just flat out better as a unit in every single way that counts. They have more range, they have the same level of armor as they do, though they are slightly faster if we're looking at the stat difference. They have 40 more range, 1 less missile damage, but crucially, they do 4 more armor-piercing missile damage compared to the regular archers. An interesting thing to note is that they both have the same kind of reload time, which is a bit ridiculous, I'd argue, because crossbowmen maybe should be reloading a bit slower than archers, but yeah, they do have the same kind of reload time, which ends up being a bit ridiculous. But effectively, once you get to tier 2, you want to start recruiting quite a lot of these guys and make basically, like, when you're at the as an Empire in an Empire campaign, when you're at tier 2, what you want to do in your with your army is you want to have a bunch of archers that you've recruited from tier 1, and then you start recruiting a bunch of crossbowmen to improve your armor piercing missile capability. And then you also get spearmen with shields. Most of the early game Imperial roster is pretty awful. The only decent unit early on until tier 3 are the spearmen with shields. They have a bronze shield, so you can use them as a front line to soak missile damage if you're dealing with that. Or if you're not dealing with massed range units, you can use them on the flanks for flank protection. They do have a bonus versus large over here, 6 armor piercing damage and 15 bonus versus large. So these guys can deal with all those nasty flankers. And what I tend to do, if I'm building a formation, I'll just give you guys an idea. Let's say I'm building a formation, like I'm putting the archers over here, right? What I would do is I'd put the Lord in the middle, and then the spearmen with shields on the flanks to cover those flanks, and maybe do a bit of a checkerboard formation as well, or maybe even a tighter formation over here to protect my guys. Because any unit that attacks through the front here is going to have to go through my hero, from my lord or my heroes, or both of them, in order to get to those crossbowmen. It also crucially gives those crossbowmen, or range units in general, a direct line of fire, which is actually quite important in Warhammer 3, given all the issues range units do have at the moment. And that is for tier 2. So archers, crossbowmen, spearmen, shields are the units you want to use. Now, later on, as you start getting into tier 3, you get more building slots, you get more unit types to recruit. Well, tier 3 is pretty important to get to early. In fact, I'd say if you're playing an Imperial campaign, pushing growth very, very quickly can make a very significant difference in your campaign. The first unit to talk about at tier 3, and there's a lot of important units that you get at tier 3 in a campaign that are going to make a fairly significant difference. But the first unit to talk about are Outriders. You can use Pistoliers as well if you so desire, because what you're interested with Outriders, and I do prefer Outriders because of their greater range. If we look at Outriders, they're 130 range. They're relatively, if I can actually get the tooltip to stick, thank you very much, game. It's a bit weird. But most of their damage, because they're a gun unit, most of their damage is going to be armor-piercing missile damage, and they have a pretty fast reload time over here. They're decently armored, relatively fast. Now, the role of Outriders, they're not there to stand and fight. They can shoot while moving, and that is important. They also have Vanguard deployment. But their primary role, and I would bother with like 1 or 2 Outrider units. Don't make a full stack, because these guys will handle poorly in sieges. So don't bother with them, because you're going to have a lot of sieges. Don't bother with them in large numbers, but 1 or 2 units of Outriders can make a significant difference in a battle. Because let's say you're fighting an enemy that outnumbers you or just has greater strength. What you want to do in that situation is you want to form a strong defensive line, maybe corner camp if you're interested in that. And let's say you've attacked that enemy army, so they might be on the defensive. Well, you may want to put your Outriders in the front. There's 2 ways of doing it. You either send the ranged unit that's fast, like an Outrider unit, to attack them, or you use magic. But wasting winds of magic before the main battle starts just to get the enemy's attention isn't necessarily the wisest move in the world. So a unit or 2 units of Outriders can really help you out. You can also get the grenade launcher version, though personally I do prefer the regular Outrider version, because while the grenade launchers will be better in terms of like their damage output, like the long range makes them more effective. Makes the Outriders more effective in the role that I want them to have in battle. If you're looking for damage, yes, grenade launchers can be more effective in that role. In terms of your main missile units that you're going to want to use at tier 3, you have Huntsmen, another DLC unit. Huntsmen are the ultimate ranged unit of the Empire. They're better than handgunners, because handgunners, as a gunpowder unit, do struggle a lot in sieges and open field battles and in a lot of terrain types. Like in a battle like this, on open field for the most part, with the exception of the hill in the middle, handgunners would be okay, but Huntsmen will do better in the vast majority of situations. They're the same range as crossbowmen. They're the same damage as crossbowmen, though crossbowmen do get 2 extra armor-piercing missile damage. So their armor-piercing damage is going to be lower, and they are obviously more expensive. But here's the thing. They shoot faster. They have a bonus versus large, which is pretty substantial and important. And crucially, they have both Vanguard deployment and fire while moving. So if you're dealing with an enemy that's slow, let's say Nurgle, for instance, which you might have to deal with in an Imperial campaign, using Huntsmen to harass the enemy before the main battle is engaged, or even outright slaughtering the enemy army without taking no casualties, is a significant benefit. So if you're playing an Imperial campaign, you want to start with archers, then crossbows, and eventually at tier 3, go into Huntsmen. And then for your main infantry line, and honestly, the only unit that is really, really worth using, like Spearmen with shields, yeah, 2 units, maybe 4 at most, but with great swords is a completely different situation. The problem with a lot of the Imperial infantry line is that their armor is pretty terrible, so they'll take a lot of damage in every single engagement, and their melee stats are pretty damn terrible. But greatswords are the only melee infantry unit that you have as the Empire, at least at the moment, that is actually worth using potentially in large numbers. They have 95 armor, they have really good leadership, they may not have the best melee defense or melee attack in the game, and they are relatively slow compared to some of the other units in your roster, but most of their damage is armor-piercing damage. They also have a bonus versus infantry, so they'll win a lot of engagements that every other unit you have in your roster would lose. And so getting like say 4, 6, 8, however many greatswords depends on how many heroes you have in your army, how many artillery pieces you have in your army, all that kind of stuff. But getting a number of greatswords as your front line is useful. If you're dealing with mass range units, then obviously using something like a Spearman Shield to soak the damage because of their missile block chance is the smarter move. But typically as the Empire, you're going to be dealing with factions like the Warriors of Chaos, Norska, the Vampire Counts, which don't have the best ranged capability, but they have a really powerful melee capability, so you want to get great swords in an Imperial campaign. But you do need tier 3 in order to do so. And it's kind of annoying to actually recruit great swords, because you don't just need like a tier 3 barracks, you also need to get a blacksmith as well, which makes it pretty annoying. And those are the units from tier 1, tier 2 to tier 3. And this is where we encounter one of the biggest issues the Empire does have in its campaign, because cavalry that's worth using, artillery, is all tier 4, which does severely limit your campaign. The Empire does have good cavalry overall, but I would never use Imperial Knights, because while they're good in field battles, they're not going to do so well in sieges, which is a pretty significant problem, until you get to the demigryphs. And I would argue that the regular demigryphs are the superior choice. Charge bonus is pretty significant. The armor piercing is pretty significant. They won't do so well in a cavalry on cavalry battle, but the role of the demigryphs isn't to win cavalry engagements, though they can do pretty decently in that respect as well. No, the role of the demigryphs is to be very, very nasty flankers, and because they have a low unit count, you can actually use these guys in a straight up melee slug. Like, they're heavily armored at 125 armor, they're bronze shielded, most of their damage is going to be armor piercing damage, and they have a 60 charge bonus. You could actually use these to break through the enemy front line at the gate, which is one of the very few cavalry units. I think Grail Guardians right now, given the changes, Grail Guardians could fill that role, or and obviously Questing Knights do that for Bretonnia. This is your alternative if you're playing the Empire, using Demigryph Knights, or really using them on an open field battle to flank the enemy and win those engagements and do a lot of charge damage with these units. But these guys shouldn't necessarily be your priority. One of your priorities would be to actually get great cannons. Yes, great cannons. The reason great cannons are important is you're going to deal with a lot of sieges, and great cannons are important to get as quickly as possible in a campaign. Even though they're a tier 4 unit and that's pretty damn annoying to deal with, great cannons are going to be important, so you do have a unit that is capable of breaking down walls and wall towers very quickly to give you breaches in the walls for your units to go through, for your heroes to go through. That's going to be important. Like 2 great cannons, I would say, or at least 1, I would say, is a must in every Imperial campaign to get it as quickly as possible. One of the reasons Gelt, by the way, Balthazar Gelt is better to play than Karl Franz is because he does start with a unit of great cannons. Then, of course, we have the Hellstorm rocket batteries. Obviously, really powerful field artillery. Not so great in sieges, but absolutely phenomenal on an open field battle against masses and masses of units. They will absolutely devastate the enemy ranks. In fact, one of the memes about Warhammer 2 is that people would make entire stacks of Hellstorm rocket batteries, especially as Gelt, and just completely obliterate any enemy they were dealing with. And that is effectively the Imperial unit roster. If I'm playing an Imperial campaign, I'm starting with archers, then going into spearmen, shields, and crossbowmen, and then eventually transitioning to a full-on army of greatswords, huntsmen, with great cannons, hellstorms, and demigryphs. What numbers you choose to get for these units depends on what you're dealing, the types of foes you're dealing with, what kind of battles you're dealing with as well. Are you facing more open field battles? Then maybe you can get more cavalry. Are you facing more sieges? Then maybe more greatswords and huntsmen. That is your decision. When it comes to hero choices as the Empire, the Imperial heroes do leave quite a bit to be desired, but there are 2 hero choices that I would say are important. First off are the Warrior Priests, and the reason behind the Warrior Priests is because they have a number of abilities. Like, they have this Shield of Faith, which gives 20% damage resistance to allies in range, melee attack to allies in range, making your melee better, and this is especially important considering most of your melee line is pretty pathetic. Crucially, the Soulfire ability. Now, the Soulfire will do pretty substantial damage if you allow the Warrior Priest to be surrounded. So the strategy with the Warrior Priest is to allow him to be surrounded by a bunch of chaff of enemy units, and then potentially use the artillery to target there, and then use the Soulfire ability. And having replenishment is pretty damn important on the campaign, and the Warrior Priests do give that. Then in terms of magic users, I would say the Grey Wizards specifically, are the best wizards to use because they're Lore of Shadows, and Lore of Shadows is pretty damn substantial. Not much to say, like Pit of Shades and of course the Pendulum, pretty powerful abilities, but those are not the only abilities that you do have access to. The Mind Razor, for instance, for magical attacks, base weapon damage, and armor piercing weapon damage is also pretty important. In terms of lore choices, I would ignore the Imperial Generals, because while the Imperial Generals can get the job done, and they do have the best mount options, so they're the best duelists of the bunch, though they're not especially great. In terms of like the first lord I would recruit in a campaign, I would go for the Archlectors, because what the Archlectors are is they're basically more powerful warrior priests. They have access to these abilities far quicker than warrior priests get. Like, you can start getting like the Grand Hammer of Sigmar at level 2, though I'd probably get campaign movement range first. And then you have the Grand Soulfire, which increases the number of missiles, and more AoE, like just the better version of the warrior priest. That's what the Archlectors give you in your campaign. An alternative to that are the Huntsman General. Now, the value of the Huntsman General is that they can buff your ranged prowess. So if you're getting a lot of archers and if you're getting a lot of huntsmen later on, then these guys will buff those units in battle, and that's important. They can also give you replenishment and campaign movement range, which is always pretty useful. They're not so great in battle because ranged heroes and lords are not so great in battle. So you have to balance it out. What is more important? Is it important to have a lord that's more useful in the campaign versus one that's more useful, far more useful in battle? You can still get Generals of the Empire if you do want to get a lord that does have a flying mount option that gives you battlefield flexibility. But outside of that, I'd probably use a lot of Archlectors in combination, especially with Huntsman General. Like maybe a Huntsman General with some weaker armies just to improve those armies, especially those Huntsmen and those Archers in those armies. But outside that, I would mainly use Archlectors. And that is all there is to say. Questine here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. If you'd like me to cover any particular race and their unit roster, lord roster, hero roster, please let me know in the comments below. And stay tuned for more.